Welcome to the 46th episode of the First Person Podcast. This month, we aren't going to be talking about the Ludonarrative Dissonance, but focusing on the Player-Narrative Dissonance. How do we ourselves legitimize doing something in a video game world that we are morally opposed to in the meatspace? Now, if everyone just wants to go around, say their names quickly, tell us what you've been playing, and then I can pass it on over to Patrick.
Hi everyone, I'm Sabrina. I'm your editor-in-chief and your book reviews and interviews section head. You can find me on Twitter at SabrinaAliciaSG. And lately, I just tried out this new game called Sentience. It's an online multiplayer game. You play as kind of AI, and you're like either a rogue or a sentinel. I'm friends with somebody who's on the developing team for that, and it's incredibly fun. It's early access, free to play on Steam. And I know this sounds like I'm advertising it. I'm not. I'm just really excited because I tried it and it's so fun and I want people to play with.
Did you stream it?
I did on Friday.
Check out her stream, guys. I'll go next, I guess. Hey, Patrick over here. I am the head of essays and managing editor. What I've been playing lately, I've been bouncing around a couple games. Probably the biggest thing is I bought an Oculus Quest. And I have been checking out the VR world, and it's bonkers. I've had it for, I guess, a few weeks now. I mostly play Beat Saber. You know, I'm kind of still I get dizzy doing too much movement. So Beat Saber is my main thing. I tried something called Lies Beneath, which is a horror game, which is very fun, but movement is either awkward or makes me dizzy. But yeah, it's a wild experience. Just the intro where you dance with a robot. My mind was blown. And that's probably not going to make any sense to anybody who doesn't have an Oculus, but yeah, it's worth trying out for sure.
I'm Alex Chalk. I'm the section editor for commentaries, and I've been playing a lot of Monster Hunter still, which I think is what I was playing last month. I'm still playing a ton of Monster Hunter. I checked last night, and I've clocked 81 hours in that game and counting. I'm just having a lot of fun with it. I would be playing Resident Evil 8, except my husband keeps leaving Returnal runs suspended, which is a thing I'm starting to have an awful lot of opinions about.
Returnal and Resident Evil 8 look amazing, but I kind of want to wait to play them until, I don't know.
Wait for them to patch. They got it. Returnal needs some patches. I have questions. Anyway, it's a lovely game. It feels really good. I don't know how you get away with charging $90 for a thing with no effective run suspension. That's 3 Hadeses.
And my name is Giuseppe Femia. I am the FPS podcast producer. I have been playing Gravity Rush 2. I didn't play the first one over the past couple weeks. And it gives me it's just this game where I am an anime protagonist and I can defy gravity and I can fall in any direction that I so choose. It's not really flying, it is falling, but gravity is changed for me. And it gives you a much different idea of how space works because everything is built horizontally. It takes you forever to fall 500 meters that way to the right. But if you were to fall down because not much is built up, it's just really quick. So in order to move around in the game, you just fall left for 10 minutes to get to where you want to go. And it's very weird. But that's enough about me. I just want to hand this over to Patrick real quick because this is his idea. So without further ado, Patrick Dolan, you will be leading this podcast from here on out. So good luck.
Hi, my name is Patrick Dolan, and I'll be leading this podcast from here on out. I guess the idea of this podcast is, for lack of a better word, player-narrative dissonance, as Joey talked about, when you do things in games that you really don't want to do, but you do anyway in service of, I guess, continuing to play the game. And this came to mind when I was playing Arkham Knight a while ago, which is, I think, the final so far Arkham Asylum-y game. And you play Batman, who is, I have my opinions about Batman. He is essentially just a superhero that kind of tries to normalize or heroicize a lot of weird kind of right-wing ideology. But anyways, as Batman, you have your Batmobile, and there's one scene where you have to like torture like Riddler's henchman, who's just like some lowly criminal who probably like robbed a bank or something like that. Not that robbing a bank is good, but it's not, you don't torture people for it, but you use sort of this remote control on your Batmobile to like, I think it's like the back wheel scrapes against like his face, or like you're lowering it down like it's going to completely destroy his face, essentially torturing him to get information on like the Riddler's whereabouts. And I remember just feeling so crappy about this, but then just like continuing on with the game. And it kind of never sat well, because like this game kind of, in order to keep playing, makes you complicit in torture. I guess my question is this okay in a video game? Which is a very open-ended question, but maybe actually the first full question would be like, how do we rationalize something like this? Like doing something that we find morally or ethically reprehensible in real life, but doing it in a video game.
I'm going to be the first to chime in. I would say that with the video game and with a lot of media in general, seeing these things happen has somewhat become normalized, especially for like movies and stuff, because there are gore flicks. But like with the video game, I understand that there is like a bit more autonomy to you actually being complicit with the actions that are taking place. And I want to say that half of it might be due to the fact that we are desensitized to like having any kind of consequence in the games that we play, but the other half might also have to do with the rationale that nobody that matters, no real person is getting hurt from our immediate actions. And in that sense, it doesn't it affect us in the same way that it would if we were seeing this happen and play out in reality.
Yeah, I guess we talked about this outside of the podcast, just sort of the perspective I have on these questions generally, and to sort of ease into my thoughts on these questions. Like this is for me like a kind of question I've fallen on both sides of throughout my scholarship. Like early on, I was really sort of concerned about the question of complicity, and like especially with regards to things like sort of like unconscionable questions of violence and things like that, like sort of what I would call spectacular violence, violence as spectacle, as something to be sort of enjoyed. I had a lot of questions about that. And then I've also fallen like far on the other side, on like into this sort of rigidly formalist space where, I'm like, well, it's not, as Joey says, it's not real. There's a difference between reality and conjecture is sort of one thing that I'm still stuck on with respect to this question is conjecture is not the same. Conjecture is a term I'm using to describe, I think, what the form of activity we engage in video games, and I think also can be applied to art and media, both broadly. It's sort of action in media is not posited generally as a real thing that's happening, but a sort of what if or an as if. It's and that's what I mean by conjecture. And so I'm not at either of those extremes right now. I do sort of wonder about the role, for example, of like spectacular gun violence in a lot of video games in normalizing, for example, the militarization of the police and the sort of glorification of guns in throughout North America. So I don't know. But one thing for me that feels really important to clarify is, so the question as phrased is how do we rationalize something in a game that we find reprehensible in real life? And then I guess for me, I sort of have a counter question for that, which is what are we, when we ask, how do we rationalize that? What is the implicit connection that we are taking up between the action in the game and the real life counterpart? Why do we assume that there is a connection between those things that requires rationalization?
That's a interesting question. So I think what it is, and I like the sort of like two poles thing going on that you were talking about, and I think my problem with this is kind of about some games, but not other games. And I think it's more when your hero is doing things, quote, heroically. So when Batman tortures someone, that is done for the greater good. But, I've been playing Hitman 3 lately, and you're not playing a hero, and you're kind of like, it's made to be goofy kind of thing, and like you are killing people, which is like I would never be an assassin. But the idea of that game is like you're not doing a good thing, you're not a good person. The people you assassinate are made out to be kind of bad guys, kind of, which sort of rationalizes your murdering. But whereas Batman is supposed to be like this hero, but in the in the game, you are torturing something, which is a heroic thing to do. It's the what is it, Jack Bauer from 24? Like he tortures people all the time for the greater good because like he's got to save the president or whatever. And so I guess it's just when you're put in the heroic place and the game is telling you this is okay, is it okay? Or is this something that we need to, I mean, a lot of people are talking about, but is this something we need to just stop accepting? And I think I'm also risking asking this question, risking being that like meme where it's like that muscle guy with his shirt off saying like, I just found out about racism, that sucks. Like, I feel like I'm coming from a privileged, thing where I was like, where I have access to these games and I can play these games and think about them critically. But yeah, I guess that's where I am, like, where it's like, if you're Hitman, you're an assassin and you're killing people and torturing them. It's kind of like in that space where you're a bad guy, or Grand Theft Auto 5, you're a bad guy torturing people. But when you're Batman, when you're a hero, or when you're this military hero, like in Modern Warfare 2, and you're, slaughtering an airport just to stay undercover, how do we rationalize that in video game playing?
I guess for myself, it's very much about inhabiting roles that I wouldn't be able to otherwise inhabit or would want to inhabit in real life. I should clarify. I have no interest in doing any of these things in real life. But I think the part that I find helps at least rationalize it in the way I think about it is that it's not necessarily that I'm the one doing it. It's that I am the means to which a story can play out. And that might be because I play mostly narrative-based games not that I haven't played other games, but it's still, even other games, I look at them as a mini story or a mini movie or something like that. So if I'm playing, like back in the day when I used to play Gears of War or whatever, right? I am the means to which that character can conduct the mission. So I'm more of a vehicle, less of the reason or the thing doing it. I don't know if this is making sense or how else to explain it in a more eloquent way, but that's sort of how I see it, and I think it kind of allows it to be seen as less of a how is this going to impact me because I am the one doing it, and more of a, oh, so why would this character choose to do this? And then that gets more complicated when you're allowed to have choice. So my favorite game when it comes to this kind of topic to talk about is Fable. The Fable series was like very, very popular for you get to be good or you get to be evil. And my first playthroughs are always like the good guy. The game's definition of good, which also ties into society's definition of what is good and what is heroic. But I always then afterwards play through it again, and this is part of games replay value when they allow you to do this. I go through and I am just as abhorrent as possible, and I'm evil to like an egregious degree just because I can and just because the game allows you to do that. So as much as it's like, it's almost like a purging of, oh, what would this actually be like? That there might be some of that there, but I think it's more of, well, I'm given the choice to play this kind of character or that kind of character. Now I want to see how much of this other kind of character I can push the game to be. That I lost my train of thought halfway through that, but I hope that all makes sense.
So, like, because it's an available act for you within the game, it is not you doing these things. It is just the game. It is the story, and you are the observer. You are the consumer of this. You are not complicit in this violence in any way.
Yeah, so sort of. I don't know that I'm not complicit in it in any way, but I wouldn't say that like I'm the one doing it. It's and I think this is just how my brain works. That it just sort of has that extra layer of disconnect. Like this is just a story and I'm just playing as this character. I'm just the vehicle for this character. It would have happened regardless of whether I was the one playing it or somebody else. And I think that's part of the way my brain rationalizes it, but I don't know that that's necessarily meaning that I'm not complicit and there is no complicity, or whether it means that I am fully complicit and whether complicity is a bad or a good thing. I think it's just how myself, and I know that there's going to at least be one other person out there, if not several other people out there, who have that disconnect of like, that's not me. As much as I might talk about it as like, oh, that's my character, or yeah, I'm doing this, it's not actually me doing it.
So I love that point. That it reminds me of this is what I understand to be the argument in Ian Bogost's Unit Operations, which I also read 5-6 years ago, so I might be a little rusty. Anyway, what I understand the argument in that book to be is basically that, so in sort of fiction, whether it be in sort of video game form or written or cinematic, action and verbs are the way things disclose to the interlocutor, the reader, the player, what they are. So a character in a film expresses who they are, through the things they do in that film. And in the same way, characters in video games, avatars, have, they're not just these sort of empty vessels for players to step into, but rather they have properties. And those properties are defined, as fictional characters, those properties that they have are defined through the things they're capable of doing, which I think is touches on what Sabrina was saying, right? Like, when you're given an avatar, I think the sort of the position we often take about it, or that is often taken about avatars, for example, when we're talking about questions about violence, in FPS, it's you doing the shooter because you're the one holding the mouse and keyboard. In FPS I'm going to start that sentence again. In first-person shooters, it's you doing the shooting because you're commanding the mouse and the keyboard. Whereas I think the sort of unit operations read on that is no. You're interacting with a character who does the shooting, but those that act of shooting, that position that they're in, is a property of the character, not of you, which I think doesn't obliterate the question of complicity, but it does complexify it somewhat. It sort of speaks to what Sabrina was saying about how there's not a one-to-one correspondence between what a video game character does and what a player does at the moral level, and that the provision of opportunities to do things is a way of telling a story. It's a way of telling you who Batman is, that he's capable of torture, even though you may not be. I think another really sort of good and readable example of this is Depression Quest, which, makes it really explicit how that divide works. So you're given, a bunch of verbs that you can action by clicking on, but as your character becomes more depressed, more and more of those are crossed out, right? And this is not about what you, the player, want to do, because you're not asked to be the player. This is not about, your own wish fulfillment. This is about putting you in, teaching you about what it is to be this avatar by showing you the way their options for action dwindle over time.
That was the most eloquent way of summing up sort of what I was trying to get at, and I appreciate you so much for that.
I really like both of your points, and I think I'm convinced by them. Just the idea that you're not complicit, it's the game. But I think the issue that I'm struggling with is the idea, and not to paraphrase Aubrey Annable from her book. Oh man, what is it called? It's the game about video games and affect, where she talks about games as effective systems, but she states sort of the idea of like when you're interfacing with a game, when you're engaging with a game, you're not only just like engaging with the game, but you're engaging with like a series, like a feedback loop of like kind of ideologies and culture and all that sort of thing. So like, even though like, it's not black and white complicity, say when you're torturing someone as Batman, you are saying that this is in a minor way, you know, you're saying that this entertainment is acceptable in showing a supposedly heroic character torturing someone as a means to an end, as a means to a greater good. And I think what doesn't sit with me is just the idea of like you are kind of, you know, you're kind of voting with your gameplay or your dollars by saying this kind of thing is okay to me in some minor way. So I know it's not you, you're not necessarily complicit. You're playing as Batman, but you're also kind of interfacing with the idea, the belief that, you know, something, to put it, you know, plainly, torture is okay when it's, you know, for the greater good, whether that's getting Riddler, some guy who, you know, I don't know, wants to just tease Batman or something. Like, it seemed like the means didn't justify the ends, but by being not given a choice by the game and having to torture to progress, or, you know, in Modern Warfare 2, having to eliminate, you know, groups of, you know, rebels or people in an airport, by saying like this is an okay thing for a hero like this to do, is what's kind of not sitting well with me.
So I think then my sort of thoughts on that would be that and this is again coming from a position where I can look at games in a certain light. And obviously, like, when a game presents a character or whatever in a certain fashion, then yeah, it's going to be very clearly like saying like torture is okay in this specific context. But what I would challenge you to think of is it saying that torture is okay, or is it simply describing aspects of the human experience in a complicated fashion? Because if we think about it, I actually have it somewhere. There was that like giant book that got published about the CIA's torture tactics. I don't know why. I think I watched it on John Oliver and he said you can legitimately buy this book, and I bought it as like a memey thing to do back in the day. I was like 19, 20 or whatever. Didn't know any better. But if you actually look through that, like it kind of, if you're able to look at it critically, if you're in that sort of position where you can do that, you can sort of take it as a, wow, humans are really kind of messed up, and we allow certain things to happen because we need that, it's that means to an end thing. And it's not necessarily that it's okay. It's more that like for some reason there is something in the human experience that has told us that this is the method to that we need to use, or that we can use to get this result. So I think if I'm able to look at a game critically like Batman, I'm not necessarily going to view it that Batman torturing this person is okay, but I am going to be able to view it as this is an unfortunate thing that the human experience has sort of stumbled into, that we have done in the past, and that in a lot of ways we continue to do to get a result. And it's not necessarily that it's okay, but it's more just explore the option to explore that human experience. So that uneasy feeling that I might get as a player having to do that is allowing me to explore how screwed up that part of the human historical experience has been. That said, you are still right in saying that to some extent we are being complicit and that it is okay. So it's, I guess my whole thoughts to sum up is that it's not necessarily saying that we are complicit. It's not necessarily saying that we're not complicit. It's not necessarily saying that there's an in-between. It's that the entire situation can't be like neatly compartmentalized is where my thoughts are going on that, if that all makes sense.
I also think that it has something to do with the overglorification of violence, especially in Western society, because the way that a lot of people are brought up and the way a lot of historical things have happened was through a great part of violence. And the media that kind of replicates it and glorifies it is almost a way to justify it for the people that had to justify it for themselves, or to, I think with the US, there was a thing where they were trying to recruit people over Twitch, which is very much a gaming platform. So just by conflating something with Modern Warfare 3 with superheroism or something along those lines, like Batman being his own form of justice in the world, you kind of get into the logical fallacy of everybody exacting their own autonomy for the glory of what they believe is right. And that has, as Patrick said, some deep right-wing philosophy embedded into that.
I think also part of the issue is like kind of what Joey was saying, but just to kind of take another way, the idea that it's normalized in the game too. Like there's not like Batman's not like this is the only way to do it. He's just like I'm going to torture this guy, or like in Modern Warfare, not to keep. I mean, these are easy targets and they're in my mind. That's why I'm picking on them. But I don't even mean the airport level. The airport level is made to like be shocking, but like the earlier levels where you're just killing and slaughtering an opposing army, like they're normalized. They're not like Batman doesn't have any scruples about torturing a dude. Or your Modern Warfare hero doesn't have any scruples about going into another country a racialized country at that, and just slaughtering, a rebel army. You don't really get their full story. So yeah, I think it's if they kind of emphasize it or like make it goofy, or like in the fact of Halo, you're playing the evil side, it's evil. It's when they kind of normalize it and say, kind of like this is okay, or this is as Joey was saying, kind of like part of the right-wing heroism, that it becomes a big issue for me.
So I see there are sort of two lines of argument here that I want to separate just so that we can maybe further disentangle them. But I'm seeing with respect to the Batman and also the Modern Warfare question, I'm seeing two lines of critique here. On the one hand, there's an ideological critique, right? There's the question of okay, this is showing us, this is a text that presents in a heroic light a person who is willing to use violence in certain ways, and for whom that violence is not troubling or is not a source of sort of moral questioning. So that's the ideological side, right? Like this sort of conveys or reproduces, for instance, certain forms of Western militarism, things like that. And as Joey mentioned, also sort of plays into the ideology of historical Western discourses of empire and colonialism and things like that. So that's one of the critiques. And then the second line of critique here, and the one that I think is the thornier one, and the one that I would like to clarify further, is that of media effects. Which is the question of, okay, we can say probably unproblematically that there are certain ideological codings in these texts. I think Batman is a really easy target in that respect. Like we don't need to. I don't know that the ideological underpinnings of Batman are an open question in 2021. Whether wherever you happen to fall, with respect to your beliefs about those ideologies, but I think that there is a second question here of media effects, of what it means to play a game, about Batman, which for me ties into the more specific question of what you mean by complicity. We're sort of going back on this question as to whether we're complicit in Batman's torture. And so I can see a few different responses to that. One, no, because Batman's torture does not exist, right? Like this is the sort of most like facile, like no, because there is no actual torture happening. There's code and there's lights on a screen. So no, we are not complicit in that respect. Are we complicit on the ideological level? Well, maybe. Do we agree with Batman? Do we think this is a good thing? Are we persuaded by this text? That does this text have some kind of persuasive effect on us as players that is perhaps liable to make us more likely to approve of these things in the future? I also, for me as a Marxist scholar, there is a question of the sort of political economic complicity. The fact that for historically, comics have been culturally tied to the American military-industrial complex, and therefore in giving money to DC Comics, never mind whatever paramilitary warfare is happening to access silicon or whatever precious metal this week. Are we complicit in that? So what I'm saying is I think there are a few different levels at which the question of complicity can be analyzed here. As something I want to flag, and maybe something for further clarification as we go forward.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I think to some extent you can be complicit on one level or even on two levels, but not necessarily all of them, or you could be complicit on all of them. And I wonder too how much of that is dependent on the player's interpretation of what's actually going on, if that makes sense. Because like I might sit there and watch Batman torture somebody and be complicit on 1, 2, or all of those levels, but at the same time take that and reject it, like reject the ideology piece of it. Or I might be somebody that just sees it in the same way that I would like watch a random thing on TV or whatever. It might just nothing would go through the sort of like from watching it. There's no ideological interpretation happening. I don't know that I agree that that's the case for most people. I think there is just on some level some type of ideological interpretation or acceptance or whatever, or rejection. But point being, long story short, that I think not only do we need to clarify the complicity we're talking about, but we also need to keep in mind that it's going to be slightly different, if not vastly different, depending on what the player is going to bring to that scenario. Do they come from a background that is going to like drill into them that sort of same ideology, or do they come from like I've never played a game before, I don't know what's going on, and therefore I don't know sort of what to expect, and therefore there might not be an opinion made, at least not right away? Or are they coming from a completely different background that would reject this ideology and would take the information here and run with it and do something else with it? If that is all making sense. I keep asking if this makes sense, but
yes, we should be asking more questions than we come up with answers, I think. And I don't have any answers to that. Like it's hard to get around how you just generally feel about things. And like, so I would say my answer to that would be that I am uncomfortable with it, and I find it problematic to engage with this kind of media. That being said, I don't not engage with this kind of media. So yeah, like I guess, I guess maybe this could be a way to pivot to the next question, is being that although we've been asking questions, we've kind of determined that complicity is undetermined, but is it fine to continue making games like this? Like in general, like how do you guys feel with your academic opinions?
this might be a hot take, but I don't know that I don't know that it's fine, but I don't know that it's not fine, because we are currently in a capitalist society, and therefore that comes with a certain, to some extent, privilege or freedom or what have you, to be able to, in certain instances, and I'm being careful because we're also in late stage capitalism where we don't get a lot of choice, even though it looks like we do. But when it comes to games, if you're in a position where you can make the choice, then you would. So, it would be okay, because you might be somebody that's totally desensitized and none of this matters to you, and you just want to play a game just because it's fun to push a button, and it doesn't matter what you're doing to some extent. But then at the same time, there's always been that question of how much of it influences people's behavior. As much as I'm very much against the argument from back when I was a kid that, violent video games creates violent kids, I shouldn't say I'm against it. I'm not for it, because I think the argument should be a lot more complicated than that. But with any media, that's always going to be the question of how much influence is it actually going to have on you. And we never seem to actually come up with a definitive answer until it's like way too late, basically. So there is that piece to it. But I mean, I don't want to say it's okay, but I don't want to say it's not okay, because who am I to decide what somebody else is going to feel, react, or whatever, or get from any game. If I'm going to play a violent video game because of, there's this idea that it might, which we're probably going to talk about later, of the taboo self or the oppositional self. I might want to play a violent video game because I just want to know what it would be like to some extent. And that's like a quote unquote healthy-ish, I guess, question mark, way to purge that like desire to know what's beyond the pale, basically. But at the same time, that might not be something that's good for somebody else to do, and it might not be okay for me to be doing. So I don't know that we can decide whether it's okay, because I think that's highly dependent on each person. As much as we would like a blanket general, this is what society deems as okay, or is this is what we should deem as okay, I think it's a little bit difficult to do that for a game.
I also feel like you aren't going to be able to stop anybody from making it. If somebody wants to have a torture scene in their game, they're going to be making a torture scene in their game, and there isn't really anything we can do about it. I think that the only thing that we can do to take responsible action towards this, to kind of combat the problematic ideology, is having discussions like this, and where we talk about the moral implications of you torturing somebody as Batman or going out as Hitman. But to kind of just ask the question, should we be making these games? People are going to buy the games that they want to play, and the games that they want to play is reinforced by the games they have played, and it's cyclical. It is a cyclical occurrence where it's just reinforced. But I don't mean to diminish the question, but there isn't really a point in asking, should we be making these games, because the games are going to be made. So the only thing that we can do is, what should our response be to these games?
I think there's also a sort of moral question, in the show, there's also a moral question, right? Like sort of evaluative, like, are these a force for good, or should we be looking for ways to intervene in the creation of these games, right? There's room for counterfactuals here, where we're like, well, presuming we were able somehow to stop this, would we? And that's a place where I don't actually have a more forceful answer than anyone else here. For me, that's just another level of consternation, where when it comes to, this comes back to the question of media effects, but when I try to think about what, media does, and part of the reason I've actually moved away from media scholarship in my own work sort of media effects scholarship in my own work, is because I don't feel comfortable making arguments about media that I can't claim apply to me. So for example, like when we're talking, you sometimes see the argument made that, like, well, I don't find this text has certain problematic ideological messages in it, which I personally don't find persuasive, but other people might. My question then is, who are these other people, and do they exist? Are we? Can we be convinced by the idea of someone who's so easily sort of won over by ideologically coded messages that we need to be worried about them? I just don't know. And if so, I don't know how we met. I don't know where to begin to think about how we would manage that economy of messages, especially because when you start to look into, for instance, like the science of persuasion, you start to find really weird things. Like a study from what year was this? I can't find the year on it, but a recent-ish study in sort of the neuroscience of persuasion, for example, that found that people are more persuaded by text if it's accompanied of an image, regardless of what the image is. So even if the image does not actually support the point the text is making, people find it more persuasive. So in some way, persuasion is like also this sort of lizard brain thing that happens in really stupid ways. And in ways where I don't think, that don't necessarily line up nicely with things like ideological critique. If maybe the problem with video games is there's too many images. I don't know.
Now you're going to get into those ones that are coming out, which are awesome. When you say too many images, I think of there's games coming out that are like no visuals. Like, so they're kind of like you're playing a blind character, but that's getting off the pace. Yeah, I find like persuasion. you bring up persuasion, and I'm wondering, like, it's not as much persuasion as just saying, like, as these things just being normalized and us being okay with them. I feel like we're already persuaded. We've already, been hailed and interpolated or drank the Kool-Aid. I think in response to like Joey's point of like people are going to make them anyways, I think that's a good point, but I also feel like we can demand better too. Like we can't stop them, but we can say, in some small way, I'm not going to accept a game where a hero is like this. I don't know, in some small way. They'll still be bought, but maybe they won't be. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like we've reached a very interesting stalemate that I like, and I think we're ready to. We might be able to call it, unless people have any final thoughts.
Final thoughts is that this crap is very complicated, and this is part of why I love what we do. But yeah, this is hurting my brain.
For someone like me who is solution oriented and doesn't just like to do explorative takes, yes, this was a painful experience for me.
Well, you know what? That's great. So we've hurt our brains, and we really, really hope we've hurt you guys listening's brains. Let us know what you think. Are these games okay? Are we just privileged ding-dongs that are just coming across this right now? Let us know what you think. You can get in contact us. You can, add us at FPS Weekly. Get in touch with us through email. firstpersonscholar.com will give you all you need. I'm Patrick Dolan. You can find me at patrdolan.com on Twitter, and I stream twitch.tv/Dr. Sandmonster or the First Person Scholar Twitch as well.
I'm Sabrina Scandura. You can find me on Twitter at SabrinaAliciaSG. I was streaming both Wednesdays and Fridays. I now have to drop down to just Fridays. For now, I'm trying to find another spot in my schedule. So keep your eye out on my Twitter for that update announcement whenever that happens. Otherwise, find me on Twitch at either twitch.tv/firstpersonscholar or twitch.tv/brainiacbree, Fridays 4:15 to 6 p.m.
My name is Giuseppe Femia. You can find me on Twitter at _foolspace, and I am the First Person Podcast producer. So, yes.
I'm Alex Chalk, commentary guy, and you can find me on Twitter at Alex_I_Chalk, CHALK, like the thing you write with.
Thanks for listening to the First Person Podcast. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia with support from the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.